Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. We're talking today about human rights as it relates to government welfare programs with a focus on China. I'm so pleased to be joined by a deep researcher on this issue, Qin Gao. She is a professor and founding director of the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University. Qin Gao's book, Welfare, Work, and Poverty: Social Assistance in China, looks comprehensively at the world's largest social welfare program, and that exists in China. And it is a word we're going to repeat over and over again in this conversation: Dibao. That is the social welfare program we're talking about. Professor Gao, thank you so much for joining us here at the Carnegie Council. It's a pleasure to meet such an expert on this issue. Dibao was implemented in China in 1999, first in the urban areas, later in 2007, spread to the rural areas of China. Describe how the program works.
Thank you. Dibao's English name is Minimum Livelihood Guarantee. So the purpose is to guarantee a minimum level of livelihood for the very poor, very needy. So it started in 1993 in Shanghai as an experiment, because back then there were huge state-owned enterprise reforms, so many workers were laid off. And the Shanghai government didn't know how to deal with these vast groups of laid off workers. And they had the money, they have some political autonomy, and they said, we will try this welfare program. They did, and it was quite successful. So a few other cities followed suit, and it became clear that it's needed and it's serving the purpose. So by 1999, all the Chinese cities, over 600 of them, adopted this policy, and it was not until 2007 this policy was adopted in rural China.
So basically, Dibao, from the way you've described it in the past, is a means-tested social assistance program. How is it any different than similar programs, for example, in the U.S.?
It's not hugely different. It's a means-tested welfare program. So anybody who wants to get this benefit will need to apply, report their family income, and then if your income is below the local welfare standard, or called the Dibao line, you qualify. Then the benefit amount you are entitled to would be the difference between your income and the local Dibao line. So there you see the Dibao program is very localized. That means that the Dibao standards are set according to the local living standard. So if you're from Shanghai or Beijing or Shanxi, where I'm from, the Dibao lines are different. So local officials have quite a bit of autonomy to decide how to run the program, how to screen the applicants and determine eligibility. Another rule that's unique for Dibao is it's very much tied to the Chinese household registration system, which is hukou. So you are either an urban resident or a rural resident. You could be a migrant, but that would mean you are not entitled to the urban benefits if you move from the rural areas to live and work in the urban areas if you don't have the local hukou or household registration status. So that excludes the migrants from the Dibao benefits.
And that's a large population.
It's huge. It's hundreds of millions of people right now.
Okay. Why did you decide to really dig deep and study the Dibao system in China? And over the years, we'll get into what you found as far as what's working and what's not. But you know, overall, has it been a successful program?
It's certainly a mixed story. As you would find many other welfare programs around the world, Dibao has been serving its due functions. One is to guarantee a minimum livelihood for the very poor. So those who are at the bottom of the income distribution have been benefiting from it. Poverty reduction effects have not been in the entirety, but modest. So people do benefit. And those who are in deep poverty, who are in severe persistent poverty have benefited more than others who are closer to the Dibao line.
Okay, that makes sense. But again, I have read that you believe Dibao works better than similar programs in other countries.
So many scholars have done comparative research, myself included. In terms of targeting, Dibao makes some errors, which means Dibao covers some people who do not really qualify for the benefit and leaves out some who really qualify. But that exists in many similar programs because targeting is hard work. If you ask me how much money I make, I may not entirely tell the truth, or I may have a fluctuation in my income sources. Right. So it's not easy. So there are targeting errors, but Dibao is doing relatively better than many other similar programs in developing countries.
And why is that?
I think it's the double-edged sword in the Dibao program because it's implemented very systematically by the branches of the Ministry of Civil Affairs in every locality. So these civil servants are dedicated to make this program successful. So they work hard and they mobilize the local communities to participate in the screening and selection and verification of Dibao eligibility. So that could work to their advantage. At the same time, it's a very costly process, right? So your personal identity and family resources, even health conditions, could be exposed to the community so that it reaches some level of accuracy. So I would say it's a mixed story.
When you look at the successes of Dibao when it comes to people living in deep poverty in China, how are you measuring that success? And are we looking at education outcomes and health outcomes and the ability to be more socially mobile afterwards? Or is this a temporary assistance program? Do you see that people are able to be lifted out of poverty, or do they remain forever on Dibao?
So in my work, I look at several different aspects because there's no one clear measure that could judge its success. In terms of poverty reduction, as I said, Dibao does reduce poverty, especially deep and persistent poverty. I also look at how families receiving this benefit use the money. So most of the families do use the money to help with their healthcare and education costs. And especially in both rural and urban areas, healthcare is a major challenge for many of these families. In urban areas, many families also use the Dibao money to pay for education. So that's a good story because people are using this money to invest in human capital. But that also showcases the lack of sufficient healthcare support and education support for these families. Another aspect I look at is social participation, how Dibao recipients feel in terms of happiness, life satisfaction, how they participate as a social citizen. And in that regard, it's not a very positive picture. Dibao's screening is quite stringent, lengthy, and stigmatizing. So if you apply for Dibao, your name will appear on a list to be posted in the neighborhood so that your neighbors and community members can give feedback about whether you truly qualify for this benefit.
Now that is very different.
That
is an aspect of the program that would be different than the similar
from
assistance
many
here.
other countries.
Yeah.
That's very true. And that's partly characteristic of the socialist system. So in China, if you ask people about it, it's not great, but it's not a big deal either. So people are used to their privacy to be exposed, and in order to get the welfare benefit, people, including the non-recipients and the recipients, would say, yes, we need to expose our information to be sure that we should truly qualify.
Which might inflict a great degree of shame on
well,
a certain type
very
of
much
person,
so.
on a lot of people, I would imagine.
Very much so. That's one of my concerns, especially for children. I mean, it certainly applies to everyone, but if you are a child and if you go to school and your family receives Dibao, your Dibao status will be known by your peers, by your teachers, which may mean that you can get additional benefits, but you will carry that label, and it's not a great one.
Your focus on your research focus has partially been on the stigma that children face as part of the Dibao system. Is there any way to quantify what the effects of that stigma are?
So far, there haven't been very quantitative research on that regard. In large national surveys, there are measures of subjective well-being, dignity, happiness, social interaction, social inclusion, but so far there haven't been research on that regard, mainly because we lack longitudinal data, or we don't track children over time to see how they are doing. That's one of my current research efforts in collaboration with UNICEF China to look at this group who have been getting welfare support, which could be a positive effect, could be having negative consequences as well. So I'm looking into this issue. There have been qualitative evidence to show how children are really subject to this shame and burden as a Dibao recipient.
I'd be very curious to know if that qualitative research speaks to the question of the transmission of poverty from one generation to the next, and whether being stigmatized as a child who's in the Dibao system and having your whole community know about that has its own risks, or whether maybe it has a benefit.
That's very complicated. Qualitative research gives us rich information, a deeper story, but it doesn't necessarily track people over a long time period. So in the qualitative evidence which I cite in my book, there has been mentions about how children are looked down upon at school, and some children feel isolated and they lose their friends.
Are they discriminated against?
Some children report that their former friends, once discovering they are Dibao recipients, would say, "You didn't tell us this fact, so you're not being honest with us as a friend." So some of these children feel isolated. There are also parents who say because they're afraid their children will be ashamed at school, they choose not to apply for Dibao.
And so they remain potentially in deep poverty.
Very much so.
This issue of children is very interesting to me, and one thing I've heard you say is that you would like to see children in a way separated from the larger conversation about poverty programs. What do you mean by that?
Not entirely to be separated, but I think children deserve more of their own focus. Children is the asset of the country. If we don't invest in children, if we don't give them an equal opportunity from the early years of their lives, the whole country is going to lose out. In today's society, I think in China, and as in many other countries, income inequality, wealth inequality, and also life opportunity inequality is very troubling to me. So if the children who are born into poor families cannot get their fair share, they don't see a future in the society, in this globalized society for themselves, then everybody is losing out. So I think we do need to think about social policies, interventions, programs for the children to support their growth, their education, their rights as children. We don't often talk about that.
And there is so much research and consensus now about the importance of sort of 0 to 5 education and health. And these are two main focuses of your research, is the importance of providing that. In China, is there general access to basic health care and education, especially in rural areas today?
Yeah, so in terms of education, there's the compulsory education law, which says every child from age 6 to, starting from age 6 is entitled to go to compulsory public education for elementary school and middle school. However, before age 6, there is no such law. So the rural children would really be suffering more than the urban children. Urban children also, there's inequality, there's urban poor children, but there's a lot of educational facility and entities in the urban areas. In rural areas, there are fewer. So actually, some of my friends are working to fill in this gap. there's private philanthropy organizations and social workers, my former students and colleagues who are working to bring early education, nutrition to the rural children.
To the rural areas.
And also some parenting education to the rural caregivers. Some are parents, some are grandparents, so that they could be providing the care and the stimulation and enrichment the rural children need from the early stage.
The urban-rural inequality gap, how successful is Dibao at addressing that? 60 million people, I read, receive the Dibao benefit, which is actually a lot less than I would have thought. I mean, I think the US, there are 45 million people or so in poverty. I mean, given the population of China, 60 million people receiving Dibao actually seems low to me.
And in the recent years, it's been fewer than that. So the most recent data show in rural areas, only about 7.6% of the rural population are getting Dibao today, and in urban areas, it's less than 2%. So poverty, as reflected by the number of Dibao recipients, have been a small proportion of the society. I think partly it's because probably the Dibao lines are not raised as fast as the living standard, right? So the Dibao line is adjusted every year to try to keep pace with the average income or livelihood level, but its growth is much slower than the average consumption or income level in the localities. Partly because now the country has shifted the focus to eradicate rural poverty by 2020, which means Dibao is playing an increasingly very small and even marginal role in addressing poverty.
Okay, so let's talk about that. President Xi Jinping has set this very ambitious goal to eradicate poverty in all of China by 2020. I mean, that's 2 years from now. Talk about the importance and the significance of that statement by the President of China from a global and a historical context.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about whether it's achievable after.
Right. So to be clear, President Xi's poverty eradication goal mainly focuses on rural China. So urban poverty is very much left out of this picture, but according to the rural poverty line, urban poverty is very small. So the 2% getting Dibao is very much reflecting that reality. So President Xi's ambitious goal to eradicate poverty in rural China by 2020 is quite unique and very much a breakthrough from both history and stands out in the global context. In Chinese history, the previous leaders all have said we need to address poverty, we need to eradicate poverty, and socialism is not poverty, but none of them set a clear goal of achieving that by a certain date. And this is entirely new. By 2020, 1 year before the centennial anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's establishment, which is 2021, poverty will be eradicated. That's very new, and that will be a major milestone. Globally, we have the US's War on Poverty, President Lyndon Johnson. In the UK, Tony Blair was really aiming to address child poverty during his administration. Just 2 years ago, Prime Minister Modi in India also said, oh, India needs to achieve this anti-poverty goal as well. So, I mean, that's encouraging as a poverty scholar. If every country's leader could shine the light to this issue, it's great. So China right now is mobilizing a lot of resources, including money, personnel, across the country to try to achieve this goal.
What role does Dibao have in reaching that goal?
There is certainly conversation about how to connect or unify Dibao with the poverty eradication goal. But I have to say Dibao is playing a very small role in this. because the focus of the anti-poverty goal is to move people out of poverty permanently. And Dibao doesn't serve that goal because it's to provide assistance. I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of how to better connect the two and look beyond 2020, right? What will happen to both Dibao and other supports or efforts to address poverty beyond that.
So what needs to happen to reach that goal and to reach maybe the longer term goals that you discuss?
Right, there have been a lot of initiatives currently in place to try to achieve the poverty eradication goal by 2020. So you have probably heard one is resettlement, to move people from these very poor regions to a more, a better, to a nearby, most likely, city or town where facilities are better, work opportunities are more available. There's also the huge promotion of e-commerce. So these large private companies such as Alibaba, Jingdong have been working with local governments to bring the e-commerce platforms
to small businesses
right.
and things.
Yeah, and basically poor people. So this project is very much targeted. So if you are or I am identified as a poor person, poor household, some resources or some approach will be applied to me so that I could reach that goal by 2020. And in addition to that, there is a local government official who is charged to help me to reach that goal by the deadline.
You know, one of the things that have come up again and again in your research are the importance of education and healthcare in truly bringing people up to and beyond the poverty line. Talk about whether that is part of Xi's plan and whether it needs to be.
I think they do need to be, because according to the current data, about half of the population being covered by this anti-poverty goal are poor because they have healthcare challenges. And I think another maybe 20 or even more % have education needs. So those are some of the deepest roots of poverty, not only in China, but in other countries
Everywhere.
as well.
Yeah.
But they are not easy to fix. So in the remaining 2 years to achieve this goal, you see more approaches of pouring resources to help mobilize the local people to escape poverty, but not necessarily through education and healthcare support. So I think more attention needs to be focused there. Education is being supported, so there are local cases where children get 5,000 yuan, a lump sum amount to help them to afford better food, clothes, studies material. But whether that could be sustainable, that's a challenge.
That brings me back to the issues of inequality. The notion of 50% of people that are in poverty, it started with a healthcare issue. Another aspect of what lands a lot of people, and especially women, in poverty is the illness of a spouse or a parent or a child. Talk a little bit about what your research says about what's happening there and how China is addressing that.
Yeah, so healthcare is a major challenge because you need money and resources and medical facilities to get your health better. But on the other hand, as you said, there is the need for care, right? If I'm sick, I need a caregiver. So these demands are simultaneously happening. Healthcare in China has been expanded, so rural residents right now have a national healthcare system. You contribute to it, and you could also get reimbursements and benefits, but the reimbursement rate is very low in the rural areas. That's one side of it. Second, it doesn't cover many specific disease, usually severe disease. So if your family happens to have one of those happening, you are going to incur catastrophic medical expenses that are not going to be covered. And then thirdly, the facilities are not there. doctors, nurses, hospitals. That's why many people in China, both from rural areas and smaller cities, come to these big cities to seek health care. And that not only incurs medical expenses, but also transportation, where do you stay, the caregivers, right?
So, and they're not working. They're not able to make income.
They cannot, yeah. So that's one side of this story, the medical side. The other side is care. So if you have a family member who has mental illness, who has a disability, who needs you to be there, then you cannot go out and work. You cannot escape poverty by pursuing work or relocating, right? So I think the care needs and also the market need to be addressed, need to be a focus when we move forward with the anti-poverty goal.
One of the ways I've heard this discussed is that care of a sick child or a parent or a spouse needs to be valued somehow in the economy.
Very much, and the same as in the US.
Yeah,
care
same discussion happening.
Yes, care is so needed, so essential, and high quality care for young children, older people, people with sicknesses is a universal need. But we don't value it. We don't pay it with good enough money. And that burden or that responsibility falls on women. In China, women care for young children, older people, family members with illnesses, and women are assumed to be caring for their in-laws and other relatives. So how do they pursue work? How do they escape poverty?
Caretaking has often been viewed as women's work in many parts of the world, including in the US. So there really is sort of a gender inequality issue as well when it comes to poverty in China, just as there is here.
Yeah.
One of the things I know you've started looking into, I don't know if you would qualify it as an alternative or how you would characterize it, is universal basic income. It's a topic we've discussed many times here at the Carnegie Council. Basically cash transfers to citizens without the kinds of means testing and strings attached of most welfare programs. So Qing, what is your view of UBI and its potential?
I think UBI is an important policy initiative. I'm so glad it's revived. It's in our current policy debates in the US, in the world, and also pertaining to China. I don't think it will replace welfare, because when we talk about welfare, we are talking about welfare rights. But UBI really shifts the dialogue to a new arena. So as human beings, what do we need, right? What are some common human needs we all share? And what would mobilize us to be able to achieve our full potential? I often think of one episode in my life. Earlier, I was in doctoral studies. My roommate was pursuing political science studies. She was from Canada. One day she said she was going to drop out of the program and to shoot films, make films. I thought, how could you do that? She explained to me they have national health insurance, which relieves her from being worried about that, meeting that needs. So I thought, wow, to have that level of safety and being able to pursue your dreams is wonderful. Of course, when we bring poverty into this, it's different. People are so desperate to meet their fundamental survival needs. But imagine having a universal basic income, right? You qualify for it just because you're a human being. And imagine the children in the poor families, rural China, could get this benefit. That would be playing such an enabling and assuring role for the children. In China, in 2001, there was really a major policy breakthrough, which was an implementation of a universal monthly stipend for orphans in China, which was later
for all orphans in China.
Yeah. Which is a UBI, universal basic income. So right now, with colleagues, I'm looking into how that's been working and whether we could expand that to a larger pool of children in China.
How did that program work? And was there who would be in charge of, at what age would the orphan get the income, and who would be in charge of it?
So that program was also initiated and implemented by the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which also implements Dibao. Initially, it targeted two groups: orphans. Some are still living with their family members or relatives. Some are placed in institutional care. But it was also a shift that the policy design behind was the children deserve this monthly benefit. And they're getting it. Unfortunately, we don't have a national survey or study following them. There have been scholars who look at specific institutions and the children hosted in their home villages. So we are doing new research to look into the effectiveness of this program.
What specifically would you like to know about that program in trying to understand whether a universal basic income might be a good, a good option?
I think I would look at what we have been talking about, whether their health care needs are better met, whether they could get better education, stable education, good quality, whether they could be able to afford what they need, right? Livelihood needs, and how they feel. Whether they feel they are more dignified, they are less stigmatized compared to other children, and they are not so much looked at as subjects in the institutions. They are more their own boss, if we could use that term. So I would want to look at both the material well-being and subjective well-being to see whether this program worked and what can be tweaked, but whether it has the potential of being expanded to cover more children.
It really is when we talk about universal basic income, we talk about a different way of looking at what basic human rights are. I wonder if you'll talk about it through that lens and the paradigm shift that would be needed, not just in China, but in discussions of universal basic income. That would be a huge paradigm shift here in the United States as well.
Yes, I feel what we in this very rich, very rapidly developing world today are struggling with is inequality, is the unbalanced life opportunities. And we don't seem to have a good solution. We are further and further divided into pockets of society. And what is our shared common needs or aspiration, right? What would be good for the social good? So I think UBI fundamentally addresses that. Different people could be entitled to the same thing, same benefits, just simply by being a citizen of the society. I think that shifts a lot of the divisions in our societies. And I'm a mother of young children. I look at my children, I think about what they have and what others may not have. And I think, especially for children, they deserve to have the same basic bundle of goods and opportunities.
Do you think from a philosophical level that will have more resonance on a society like Chinese society than it would in a not that China doesn't have its share of capitalism, but in a purely capitalistic, individualistic society like the US? It's a philosophical question.
Yeah, that's been on my mind, especially as I compare the US and Chinese societies. They are very similar in valuing individual efforts. So efforts is hard to measure. I mean, you could say this person worked hard, the other person didn't work hard, but the endowment of what you are born into often is not taken into account when we talk about that.
Yeah. When you're born into privilege versus when you're born into poverty, there's just different opportunities.
And the awareness that we don't even have, because you are born and you are brought up in this particular environment, whether it's a poor or a rich environment, you're just not that aware of what's outside and what your peers are doing. So I think we do have those barriers to break and those bridges to build. And I'm hoping UBI, as one of the policy solutions, could try to achieve that. It will not be easy in the US or in China, because that's not very much deeply rooted in our cultures.
It also challenges this, I think, very American assumption or fear that, you know, giving people free cash will create a disincentive to work.
Yeah.
Proponents of UBI generally seem to believe that people in general want to work.
Yeah, and from my research about welfare work and poverty, people do want to work if they can. Of course, some people don't think the care they are providing is work, because our society are not socialized to think that way, which is unfortunate. And then all the people who are getting the benefits want to work. They want the dignity. They want to be able to contribute. And there's a body of research in the international literature to look at how welfare benefits affect people's consumption of what they call temptation goods, basically alcohol, cigarettes, drugs. We don't have evidence to show that people are using the money not so wisely.
And even going back to Dibao, what you're showing is that the assistance programs, people generally spend that on essential needs.
Yes.
And
especially education.
And education, which will better their lives and hopefully help them out of the cycle of poverty.
Yeah.
Also going back to Dibao, you talked a lot about targeting and the inefficiencies of targeting. So in a welfare assistance program, what that generally means is you have to make sure these people don't have a car, don't have a refrigerator, don't have a pet.
Yeah,
I
and
read
don't
that
send
in your research.
don't
Because
send
if you
your
have a
kid
car, a pet, or a refrigerator, you are not eligible for Dibao.
Right. And don't send your kids to a very fancy school.
Fancy school, because otherwise you don't qualify
That's exactly
for
right.
the assistance. But that is a very costly process.
Yes.
Targeting who exactly in the community should or should not be a qualifier. With universal basic income, you basically get rid of that part.
That's exactly right. And in that current system, you have to re-verify people's eligibility every 3 months, every 6 months. So it is very costly. And the other side of the cost is the social cost, isolation, shame, because Dibao does invite your neighbors and community members to give input and basically monitor your behavior, your consumption habits. At the same time, UBI will not be easy. China is such a huge country. Imagine the costs that would need to go into it. But I would say that the current poverty eradication goal is investing a lot of money into the project. Every poor person identified to participate in this program is right now getting on average about 5,000 yuan renminbi. And that's not trivial. Imagine shifting that to a universal benefit. So I think when we think about UBI, we have to think about what we're contrasting it with, right? What's the alternative?
Let's take a step back and just talk about the work that you've spent your life pursuing. What do you feel like the impacts have been thus far of your research?
Yeah. It's been, I love this research. So even if I don't get any rewards for this, I probably would still do this work. But it's gratifying to see the impact of my work, both in terms of scholarship, but also policy impact. I do talk to central government and local government officials about my research findings. Sometimes they may not be very happy to hear what we discover in our research, but they do appreciate it. And I think these officials have a genuine interest to improve the performance. And many of them also struggle with the same challenges we face, how to unify or better cooperate different programs such as Dibao and the poverty eradication program, how to really address the needs of different participants, children, people with illnesses. So maybe the real policy reward is more complicated and things happen slower, but I do try to share my research findings and hope to promote certain policies I think, based on the scientific research we do, is a better solution.
And do you think President Xi's clarion call for eradicating poverty has given researchers like yourself an opportunity in ways that you haven't before?
Focusing on poverty is new, and poverty research is getting a lot more attention these days. So that's great, but the things in the field in the country are happening so fast, right, to achieve the goal. So we as researchers are running, trying
to get the data.
Right, trying to not rush to conclusions, but still stick to the standards.
You want to get it right.
Right, and that's not easy if things are happening so fast. So at this point, I'm very glad I did the Dibao research, really building on years of research and drawing from my colleagues' work to look back from 1993 to today. What have been happening, what have we achieved, and what to do next. And I'm hoping those findings would be able to inform not only Dibao in China, but also similar welfare programs in other countries, but also this ongoing poverty eradication program. And I'm doing all I can to also study the targeted poverty, anti-poverty project to see what are some effective moves, measures, and what can be modified to be better, and what would we do beyond the 2020, right? Because time will continue, children will continue to grow up, and there will be children born into poverty. People
and there will be new challenges. I mean, a big challenge is we're discussing as far as U.S. inequality is the technological disruption created in the job force. President Xi, in issuing this call, is it a sign of moral leadership?
I think so. I think he certainly probably would like to appeal morally. I think he has said in his speeches that so this very much resonates with socialism, right? China is developing very quickly, aspiring to be a world leader, probably already a world leader in President Xi's mind. But then we're leaving some people behind, and that's not okay. Especially in rural China, many rural residents truly believe the Communist Party and socialism should be responsible for supporting people's livelihood. So I think this certainly resonates with the Chinese citizens, especially in the rural areas.
Is there a stability issue for the Chinese government as well, to have sort of growing inequality as there become more and more Chinese millionaires and billionaires, and those in rural areas that are still in Dibao and are being left behind?
That's certainly a potential threat. How Dibao started was partly to address this worry, right? In urban areas back then, people who used to have very stable, secured, lifelong jobs lost them. So the governments would be, more local governments back then, would be worried that stability would be challenged, social order would be disrupted, and economic growth would be slowed down as a consequence. So I think this very much goes back to that narrative. Rural poverty needs to be addressed.
So political reasons as well, and perhaps the survival of the Chinese party system and its economy also.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's true for many welfare programs and anti-poverty focuses around the world. So it will be very interesting and important to see what happens in 2020.
Qin Gao, thank you for illuminating so much when it comes to China and poverty and the steps that are being taken. Your research is fascinating, and we appreciate you sharing your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much.